The US military in Vietnam just got a new secret weapon. A fighter jet that could fly faster than any bomber or outmaneuver any enemy aircraft. It could carry anything from air-to-air missiles, anti-tank rounds, or even a 1,000-pound bomb. But its ultimate move, it could take off vertically. That's right, this monster fighter jet had 8 engines inside to allow it to take off from anywhere at any time. No runways, no aircraft carriers, just all American jet power. This is the insane fighter jet that we never got, the jack of all trades, the incredible Bell D-188 VTOL fighter jet. The story of the D-188 is a classic tale of American ingenuity that is totally overkill. 8 engines? Really? Especially when you consider that the enemy was fielding older MiG-15s and 21s with single engines. It's the fact that the Americans were using the latest and greatest technology to get the job done that I find so inspiring. And you know what? There's a lesson here. To actually use game-changing technology as it's made and to not be left behind. Exactly why I switched to the Opera web browser and its amazing built-in AI feature, Aria. Aria AI is unlike any others. I love that it has built-in AI image generation to bring my videos to life, AI image recognition to help identify what I'm looking at, and the fact that it's connected to the internet so it can provide real-time information. And it can also be trained to write in your own personal style to help figure out writer's block. And that's not even the tip of the iceberg, because it's not just the AI feature. Because I use the internet so much for work, the new Opera web browser has been super helpful in getting work done faster and better. I love my tabs, and Tab Islands makes it easy to keep everything organized by topic. Then built into the browser, I also have a free VPN, perfect for keeping my browsing private on the internet. And then there's also social media platforms and music built into the sidebar so I can chat and listen to tunes whilst I'm making the next Found and Explained video without ever leaving the browser. So if you're ready to join me in the future, go to the link down below and get the Opera web browser and its amazing AI Aria today. Special thanks to Aerospace Projects Review who contributed to this video today. The US military was obsessed with vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, or VTOL, in the 1950s. Some designs were totally wacky, like turning a F-104 into a rocket ship, and another was a giant VTOL aircraft with 4 ducted fans. And then there was those insane vertical jet fighters with rocket pods. Wow. The US Air Force was leading the charge with these creations and had commissioned several studies in the early 1950s that looked pretty darn cool for jets that could fly straight up and intercept Soviet bombers at the speed of sound. Alas, a lack of funds had ended these projects, but Bell had made it quite far with one design with 4 engines, called, very confusingly for this video today, the D-188. And I'll call it the early D-188 to spare your head spinning like a rotor. The Navy heard about this design through the grapevine and licked their lips. Finally, technology had reached a point that a VTOL naval jet made sense. If a plane could take off from a deck that was only the size of its own body, no longer would large aircraft carriers be necessary. Even the smallest patrol boat could feasibly have an air wing. So in 1957, the Navy got in touch with Bell and asked to see if their early VTOL concept aircraft could be reworked to operate off their decks. Bell would start with the verter-burner concept, labeled the D-139, with a single big engine, either the J-75 or J-79, with several afterburners, one big one for level flight and 6 small ones for vertical takeoff and landing built into the fuselage. The 6 verter-burner thrust chambers would be rotated from vertical to somewhat aft for transition to and fro level flight. However, the propulsion system took up too much of volume and precluded the area ruling. This aircraft was just too heavy and couldn't really carry anything. But that's when Bell became aware of the J-85 program at General Electric. This small engine provided much better thrust to weight than existing engines, particularly as a lift engine. So they went back to the drawing board with the D-188 and redesigned it to have 2 J-79s for high performance and forward flight, and then a line of 5 J-85s between them for vertical lift. But there was a problem with this design. You see, all those interior J-85s were dead weight except for takeoff and landing, so they needed a way for them to be used in horizontal flight. So the next step was to use those same engines for vertical and horizontal thrust, and what better way than to put them in rotatable pods on the wingtips. The first iteration was a 4-engine aeroplane with 2 afterburning J-85s in each pod on each side. But this wasn't quite enough thrust for Mach 2, so 2 other engines were added to the mid-fuselage with a diverter valve used to provide vertical thrust at the center of gravity, and afterburners in the aft fuselage for additional thrust in level flight. The speed and endurance was apparently acceptable for the Navy for an intercept mission, so the Navy rocked up with their giant bags of cash. However, a parallel Bell design study based on the Air Force requirements necessitated more range, and therefore more lift on takeoff to carry all that extra fuel. So a new pair of lift-only engines was added to the forward fuselage, and the 2 afterburning engines were moved to the aft. Approved by the Air Force, they matched the funding with the Navy for this preliminary design that would now have 8 engines. It made a lot of sense, and this was the basis for the D-188A, possibly the most overkill fighter jet ever made. By early 1958, a mock-up of the aircraft was built and its design was locked in. It would have the classic Coke bottle shape for drag reduction, a single pilot seat, 2 wing mounts on each side, and an internal weapons bay. It kind of looked like the Lockheed F-104, but it actually had nothing in common. Now, I know you're itching to dive into its insane 8-jet engine layout. The first 2 engines were located as a pair behind the cockpit and used exclusivity for VTOL operations to carry the forward half of the aircraft. It would also have little openings on the top of the aircraft that would open up to allow oxygen inside. Next, there were 2 engines in the rear of the aircraft for forward flight and also to lift the rear of the plane when in VTOL. And lastly, there were 4 incredible rotating engines in nacelles on either side. These air takes were optimized for high-speed flight, and thus when the aircraft was in a vertical takeoff mode, the front half would actually open up 10 inches forward to allow plenty of air to be utilized. Seriously, at this point, Bell had entered the realm of science fiction. For minor adjustments and stabilization, there were also small air thrusters that would puff jets of air from the engines. It would take roughly 60 seconds for it to take off stationary to forward flight, and only a moment more to rise up to Mach 2 at 35,000 feet. Just insanely quick. But the plane was also capable of normal takeoffs and landings, which was more optimal when carrying heavy weapons. And let's talk about the weapons that this bad boy would carry. Now, at first you're looking at this image, and you're thinking, damn, that's a ton of firepower. But the truth is that this is just like a magazine advertising 6-pack abs in only 7 minutes. This is only the range of possible weapons that this aircraft could use, but in reality its actual capacity was far less. For example, only 2 bombs on either side and 4 side winders inside the bomb compartment, rated only to carry up to 1,000 pounds otherwise. And this is a pretty big deal, which I'll get back to in a moment. The US military envisioned that not only would this aircraft be perfect for naval operations in the Air Force, but also America's allies in Western Germany. It could be scattered throughout Western Europe in simple bases built deep within mountain ranges or forests that lacked room for runways. Only a simple road or a helicopter pad could support operations, meaning to the Soviets, the enemy was everywhere. Now, I should also mention out that the D-188A was actually 2 different versions for both the US Air Force and Navy. The former had much larger tailplanes with an aft fuselage that was wider, essentially a bigger booty for the plane, with the latter, the naval version, having a single larger folding ventral fin for high-speed controls, but it would actually fold away so it could land on an aircraft carrier, as opposed to the 2 smaller ventrals on the Air Force plane. Bell had not actually made a jet aircraft since World War II, the P-63, and sought to cut off concerns from the military by partnering up with Convair. Convair would build the plane and Bell would design it. Additionally, around this time, Bell would push to get an official designation of the program, the Bell F-3L for the Navy and the Bell XF-109 for the Air Force. And while we have proof that Bell sent these requests, we don't have any evidence that the Air Force or the Navy agreed to this official designation. So if this aircraft was so incredible and the design was sound, Why did we never get it? Bell was very confident with the design and knew that with a little bit more funding, the United States would be the first superpower with a VTOL jet in a world before the 1970s. But there was an issue with the design. Because of how complex it was, the Air Force was concerned that basing it throughout Europe would be too complex when it came to maintenance and operation. Imagine some Western German crew needs a spare part for one of the many engines, grounding the aircraft in the middle of a forest for seemingly months. And speaking of the ground, the launch pads for takeoff couldn't be made out of dirt or concrete, as the exhaust from 8 jet engines would be too much. Thus, it would need to be something more thicker and expensive, escalating the costs of the program. And simple fighter jets at an airbase didn't have these problems. Another issue was the weight to weapons ratio. As mentioned before, it could only carry 1,000 pounds of weapons in its internal bay. For 8 engines burning all that fuel, this wasn't the most practical aircraft. Other jet designs could carry a lot more, which was one of the final reasons why the Air Force decided to walk away from the project. They realized that for the same cost, they could build something like the F111 Aardvark that could easily match the speed and carry more without the need of VTOL capability. As for the Navy, without the Air Force on board, they were reluctant to fund the entire project themselves, and thus the government would walk away in 1961. Not to give up all hope, Bell and Convair would spend another few $1 million refining it with the hopes to win a European contract. A few months later, NATO launched the competition to develop a supersonic VTOL strike fighter. One of the contenders was EVR from West Germany, which submitted a bid based on a simplified version of the D-188A. With support from Bell, the VJ-101C fighter was built and successfully flown. Its design closely resembles the D-188A, except the tail engines were removed and the area was streamlined. Despite its success and actually have a prototype flying, the VJ-101C was eventually replaced with another VTOL project called the VJ-101D, which aimed for a cleaner, high-speed aerodynamics using fixed lift jets. However, this next aircraft never progressed beyond the drawing board, and thus the D-188A never saw active service. Looking at the design today, we can see that it wouldn't work very well. Obviously, rotating engine pods would be awful for stealth, so we would never get it as a modern fighter in this stealth era. But it's an interesting thought experiment. Additionally, the issue of all those early designs was the huge number of moving parts and the weight of the lift systems. There was hardly any room for weapon systems. Plus, there is also a slight conspiracy theory that the US government never intended for Bell to move ahead with this project, but they did want to keep the engineers at Bell working away just in case the war with the Soviet Union went hot. But if we use this technology today, I could imagine a modern variant of something like the A-10 Warhawk in a support role operating from small fields. A VTOL jet with modern engines, huge weapon loads, and a longer hover time would be very useful in a war, say in Eastern Europe. It's funny to think that this aircraft, had it been built, likely the F111 would not have, and then the US, British and Australian Air Forces would have looked very differently with a reliance on VTOL aircraft, and we would have seen more designed and rolled out, and perhaps even spurred the actual deployment of all those VTOL civil designs that I keep making videos about. One can only imagine. This video would have not been possible without the excellent work and research done by Aerospace Projects Review. Scott Lawthor is a legend, and I thank him with his help putting together all of this information for us today. So be sure to click down below and go check out his website, and he's got a whole bunch of other projects and books that are all really interesting, and you can read it all day. Enjoy!